In this way it came to pass that the Edain dwelt in the lands of the Eldar, some here, some there, some wandering, some settled in kindreds or small peoples. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are going to be looking at the different clans and houses of men, and what became of them throughout the later ages. We will look at the renowned leaders, moments, and regions of these clans. More information may be found in the articles and videos in the description and cards as well. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me. Let's begin our tale. In this video, we'll have to generalize a little bit, as there are so many factions and subdivisions of the houses of men, but in my mind, the best way to categorize them in an effective and efficient way throughout the ages of the world is to look at the three houses of the Edain, who became the Dunadine and their descendants, also known as High Men, the Easterlings of the First Age, who may have had kinship with the Dunlendings and other similar men, the Middlemen or Men of Twilight, such as the Men of Rhovanion, and the Men of Darkness, who were the Men of the South and East in the later ages of the world. So really there will be four categories. Now these terms of High Men, Middlemen, and Men of Darkness come from Faramir out of the Two Towers, and his upbringing in Gondor, and how they defined these terms. However, throughout this video, I will use the terms in a broader sense than the Gondorians did, as we as readers know things that the Gondorians didn't about the lineages of different folk. I won't speak about the Drúedain or Woes as much in this video, other than to say they were an offshooting branch related to men, and most related to the Haladin, so please check out the video on them for more information. The same goes for Hobbits, who may have been related to men in their distant past, but I also made a similar video talking about their possible origins, so please check that one out as well. The difficult thing in particular about the clans of men in comparison to the clans of dwarves, elves, or even hobbits is that there are so many offshooting branches and mixing between them. Whereas those other kindreds do have some mixing, but mostly can be easily recognized in their clans or houses, even in later ages. Anyway, with all of this in mind, let's first talk about the three houses of the Edain, who would later become the Númenorians and Dunadine. The three houses of the Edain of the First Age of the world were the different tribes of men who journeyed west into Beleriand after awaking in Hildorien. The first clan of the Edain to be encountered by Elves was the House of Bayor, led in that time by Bayor himself. He met Fenrod Felagund and later served him, and his people would have a great liking for the House of Finarfin. His people were of darker hair and stouter builds, and most resembled and mirrored the Noldor of all elven clans. They would settle in Astolad and later in Dorthonion, before being in large part persecuted and destroyed by Morgoth and Sauron. Some descendants of the clan would survive in Barahir and his son Beren, while others such as Morwen and Rian went on to mix with the people of Hador, and their blood would go on to mix with that of the Elves, and some others in the House of Bayor would mix with the people of Halath. Speaking of the people of Halath, the Haladin were the people of the second house of the Edain, and they were also dark-haired, but shorter than the people of Bayor. They were more reclusive than the other houses, settling first in Thargelion, before moving into the forest of Brethil. In my mind, they most likely resembled the Teleri or Sindar of all the elves. Notable members of this house were Haldad and his daughter Halath, who led the folk, Haldir, who led the people in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and Brandir, who played a role in the story of Turin to Rambar, eventually being slain by that man. They were harried and harassed by orcs throughout the First Age, and they suffered many great sorrows. The third and final house of the Edain was the folk of Marak, or the House of Hador, and this was the strongest of the three clans and the most warlike. They were tall and golden-haired, being most similar to the Vanyar clan of elves, and they served the House of Fingolfin. After coming through Estalad, they would go on to live in Hithlum and more particularly Dorlomin. The notable members of this clan were Hador, a fierce warrior who fought in the Dagor Bragorlach, Hurin, the greatest warrior of men in the First Age, his brother Hur, and their respective children, Turin Turambar and Nienor, and Tur, who went on to mix with the Elves of Gondolin. While this house was proud and mighty before the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, after Morgoth had victory in that battle, the Easterlings of the First Age harried and enslaved many people in that clan within Dorlomin. However, from Tur and his elven wife Idril would come Eärendil, and from Eärendil and his wife Elwing would come Elrond and Elros, who were descended from all three houses of the Edain, just as it was for many of the Edain by the end of the First Age. After the end of the First Age and the fall of Morgoth, the Valar gave to the surviving Edain the island of Númenor, and Elros would be its first king, and thus the Edain became the Dunadine, the Men of the West, and through time and mixing, they really became one clan. The Dunadine would populate Númenor and afterwards would go on to live in Arnor and Gondor primarily, but the blood of these folk would mix with the Middlemen over time, and by the later ages of the world, the Dunadine would be rare indeed. Some Númenorians would become evil and would mix with the Men of Darkness in the south. While there are many notable members of the Dunadine, in my mind the most notable are the first king Elros Tar-Minyatur, Elendil the Tall, who led his faithful from Númenor and established Arnor, his sons Isildur and Anarion, who established Gondor, and their great descendant Aragorn, King Elisar, who reunited the kingdoms after the downfall of Sauron. Thus we have covered the Edain and Dunadine, the High Men, but what of the Easterlings that were, in large part, the enemies of the Edain in the First Age? This group is quite interesting, for while they are named Easterlings, I am not sure that they actually share any relation to the Easterlings of the Second and Third Ages in Eastern Middle-earth. In fact, their language and geographical positioning makes me believe that they are more related to the Dunlendings, the Losoth of Forokel, and any other men who may have been in Eriador during the First Age. However, this connection is just conjecture on my part, and since the origin of the Easterlings of the First Age is shrouded in mystery, I'm giving them their own category within this video, as they might be related to the Middlemen, or they might be more related to the Men of Darkness, or they might be their own faction overall, I'm unsure. These men would dwell in the March of Maethros for a time before the Númenor, but afterwards many would go on to dwell in the lands of the House of Hodor, in Hithlum and Dor-lómin. Now not all of these men were evil, for some of its notable folk, such as Bor and his family, stayed loyal to Maethros and the Feanorians, while others, such as Ulfang and his house, betrayed these elves, and were loyal to Morgoth, reaping their reward when Morgoth had won the Battle of the Númenor. After the end of the First Age, those who fought against the Valar died or fled into Middle-earth, while others who were related to Bor continued to dwell in places in Eriador and would probably mix with the Middlemen. Next we have the Middlemen, or the Men of Twilight, and these were folk that stayed in eastern lands during the First Age, but were still to the west of Eldorien. Some of these Middlemen were also known as pre-Númenorians and were related to the Haladin. Thus they shared kinship with its later folk as well, the Dunadine. It should also be noted that the Númenorians typically used the term Middlemen to describe their allies who were not directly Númenorians themselves. But it seems this could also describe more men than just that, for the connections amongst the Men of Middle-earth ran far back, and could possibly be drawn between the Dunlendings and the people of Haleth, just as the connection between the Rohirrim might be drawn to the House of Hodor as well. Beyond the Dunlendings and their close relations, those who would be called Middlemen would be the men of Rovanion, who became the Eotheid, who then became the Rohirrim, the men of Dale and the Bardings, the woodmen near Greenwood or Mirkwood, and the Beornings. This would also be the later men of Bree and others who dwelt in the wilds of Eriador. Indeed, this is the most spread-out clan of men, for some dwelt in Rovanion, others dwelt in Calanarthon or Rohan and by the sea, while others were in Eriador. But as time went on, they mixed blood with the Arnorians and Gondorians, and probably the men of the east and south as well, so I'll just circle the whole map while I'm at it. I would say the most notable men of this clan were Fram the Slayer of Scatha the Dragon, Eorl the Young, who led his people to Rohan, Bard the Bowman, who slew Smaug, Beorn the Skin Changer, Theoden, king of Rohan, who died to protect Gondor, and his niece and nephew Éowyn and Éomer Eodig. It seems this group would make up the majority of men in Middle-earth after the Third Age. Finally, we come to the Men of Darkness, as they were named by the High Men, those of the eastern lands of Rhûn and the lands south of Mordor. These factions would be named the Easterlings, not those of the First Age, Haradrim, Corsairs of Umbar, the folk of Nirn, the people of Khond, and other such peoples. They were likely more numerous than the Dunadine, but possibly not quite as numerous as the Middlemen. These folk probably never went west at all after awakening in Eldorien, and stayed in the eastern and southern lands of the world. After the fall of Beleriand, Sauron made his abode in Mordor, near their lands, and would, throughout the later part of the Second Age and throughout the Third, conquer and subjugate them, and thus some willingly, and likely many others unwillingly, made war with the Middlemen and Dunadine. Some Dunadine would mix with the Haradrim and Corsairs, and they would be the Black Númenorians. After the fall of Sauron, the battles they fought with the West were folly, for King Elisar of Gondor and Éomer, king of Rohan, would have victory over them. But I would like to think that peace was eventually struck between the men of the south and east with the people of the west, and a great mixing between these folks could take place, once Sauron was gone forever. For indeed I believe all men of Middle-earth could be related to these four groups, the Edain of the First Age, the Easterlings of the First Age, the Middlemen, and the Men of Darkness. And thus with all of this covered, we come to the end of our tale on the clans of men. From these stories we can see that, if we look back far enough, we all share some kinship with one another. We should let that guide our compassion towards each other. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video and learned something new from it. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this video with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about these different clans? Let me know in the comments below. These different clans are really interesting, especially concerning how they tie into the later peoples of Middle-earth, and I hope this video clears up some things with the Silmarillion in particular. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian de la Torre, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scout and Tobias Goldner, Merton, John Hume, Tom Bombadil, Richie93, Jennifer Wood, Sam McBee, Matt Sabatch, Quantum Catalyst, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Ben Gardner, and Kondar. Thank you to all of my patrons, it means a lot. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. I'll see you all again next week with a video on why the Elves left Middle-earth. Everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.